So I've been planning to make a shorter, more concise video all about the tools and techniques that I use to color grade my footage, but I figured I'd try something a little bit different for today's video in addition to that by just doing a longer, not really edited down video and going into my editor, showing you my screen, and showing you exactly how I would color grade a few different types of shots. As usual, the software that I'll be using to do this is HitFilm. I'm going to be using the Pro version so that I can use the scopes, but you don't have to use the scopes to color grade, they're just a little bit helpful for me. So you can do all of these effects and techniques in HitFilm Express, which is completely free, you just can't use the scopes. I hope you enjoy this slightly different style of tutorial, so let's go hop into the editing software and I'll show you how I would color grade a few different types of shots. Alright, so I think before talking about the tools and the techniques that I'll be using to edit these clips, we should talk about my workspace. This is the workspace that I use to edit videos, but I have a separate one just for grading, so we'll switch over to that, and I'll show you a little bit about why I've made the decisions that I have for this workspace. I've gotten rid of the trimmer entirely because I don't need it. I do all of my editing first and then grade after that, so I don't need to be using the trimmer to add anything to the timeline, so it frees up space by getting rid of that for something like the scopes, which scopes, if you haven't used these before, are a pretty nifty color grading tool. You don't need them, but I like to use them for getting the exposure right, making sure that the highlights and shadows aren't clipping. I have effects and controls over here on the left, so I can drag stuff between them easily because I'm going to be using a lot of different effects, and I have a nice large preview window in the middle. Something else I've done that you don't have to do obviously, and it's not necessarily an important contribution to this, is added history over here. I don't have any use for the history tab, but sometimes when you have a lot of clips in your timeline and a lot of different color grading effects, having the scopes being displayed during playback can make the editor lag a little bit, so I added history over here so I can just hide the scopes and get a faster, smoother playback in the editor. But this first clip here is, I think, just a good example of a standard teal and orange grade. It's not a nighttime shot, there's not any weird funky effects I need to add to this, and I think this is a pretty good representation of most of my shots. This is also shot on a fisheye lens, so I'll have to start out by correcting that. You can see there's a little bit of distortion over here on the horizon, so I'll just use the Action Cam Lens Distort effect, go into here, set the scale anchor to the height so it doesn't get smaller when we adjust the effect, reverse it so that it's doing the opposite of fisheye distortion, and then turn the field of view up until we can see that horizon start to straighten out. Now, thankfully, I don't have to do that for all of my clips because I have a preset already made for this that I can just drag onto the clip, and it already has all the right settings. But if you don't have a preset like that, just do it once, right click it, and hit create preset, and then you can do that. And I've also created presets for all of the other effects that I use frequently for color grading. So I use curves on just about every shot, I use HSL on every shot, teal shadows on most of my shots, so I have that. That's just set to take a little bit of red out of the shadows and add that teal tint that you can see right there. It'll be more prominent once we've added contrast. But all these effects that I use consistently, white balance, sharpness, are in this color correction preset folder. So that's definitely something to improve your workflow. If you're not already doing that, that will save you a lot of time. Just make some presets, put them in a folder in your effects bin, and you will have a much faster and more enjoyable workflow when you're editing. But for this clip, I'm going to start out by using the curves adjustment, and there aren't really any skin tones in this clip, so I don't need to use this part of the scope, so I'll just use one, so I have very large display of that. And as we can see, if we look over here in the scopes, the highlights are clipping just a bit, so I'm going to drag that down so we don't technically have any white pixels in the shot. Next, I'm going to add some contrast, and this is a pretty bright exposure. So I'm going to start out by bringing the shadows down a bit to even it out, and then I'll add some contrast back in by bringing the highlights up. Now I would like for this, for the ground to be brighter, so I'll just bring the entire thing up, bring the shadows up a bit, and then compensate by brightening the highlights. But I don't really like what's going on here, because to get the ground to the exposure I want it to be, I have to overexpose the sky. Thankfully there is something I can do about that, and something I add to a lot of my shots, which is a gradient. So before the curves adjustment, I'll add this color gradient, and it's set to an overlay blend mode, black to white, and I'll set the opacity to 50%, which basically makes it to where the white goes away when it's set to overlay. And then I'll set it right here so that it's just darkening the sky. And then we can add curves back in, correct that highlight again, and then do another contrast adjustment. And as you can see, that's a better exposure than what we had before. We're bringing back that detail in the sky. So if you want to go for this kind of, not necessarily HDR, but like a lot of detail retained, very dramatic sky look, definitely try out using that color gradient. But now that I've got the contrast pretty much where I want it, I'm going to move to adjusting the colors, and I do that using this HSL, or hue, saturation, and lightness effect. This is probably my favorite effect in all of video editing. HitFilm's HSL is just very functional, very good. I love using it. As you can see, we have separate options to adjust the hue, the saturation, and the lightness of all of the individual colors in our image. Biggest tip for using this effect, don't touch the lightness because it looks terrible, but if you adjust the hue and the saturation, you're going to get some very interesting customizable effects in your clip, and you can kind of emulate that teal and orange style that you would get from using something like a LUT without actually using a LUT. So this is a very good way to really dial in and customize the colors in your shot. And what I want to start out by doing is going for a complementary color scheme, which this clip already has, because we have kind of orangish yellow in the bottom half and blue in the top half, which complement each other. But I feel like the blue is a bit much in the sky, so I'm going to bring down the saturation just a bit and then shift it over to kind of a tealish tint as opposed to blue. So that's the first bit of going for that teal and orange effect. And then I'll even that out by going into the yellow, which we can see down here. And then since the yellows and the reds are kind of faint and I want them to be a very vibrant orange, I'll saturate this quite a bit, as well as saturating the red. And then we can see we're really bringing out the colors down there. And I want it to be a little bit more orange than yellow, so I'll leave the red how it is, but shift the yellow just a little bit over to the left to where we get more of that orange color coming through. So as we can see, that's quite an adjustment. Looks like we've added a lot to the clip, but we haven't. And I'm going to finish off that teal and orange style by adding the teal shadow effect in my presets to there, which just adds a little bit more contrast to the clip, makes it look a bit more dramatic by adding that teal tint to the shadows. And finally, I'll finish off with a sharpness effect. So that's our final clip as opposed to what we started with. Pretty big change, even if you don't include the fisheye adjustment. We've made quite a change there, and as you can see, we're preserving a lot of detail in the sky while doing that. I want to show you how I would grade this next clip because I think it's a pretty unique example. I actually wouldn't go for a teal and orange look on this just because the shot doesn't offer any kind of blue, and the shot kind of reminded me of The Hobbit for some reason, and I really wanted to push that yellow and green style grade further while still having something with a good contrast in it. So what I want to do with this is really bring out the yellow and red and orange tones in these trees back here, as well as mainly this fence, and kind of push the green down, get it to kind of a desaturated and more of a cool type tone to complement the orange up here. So as usual, I'm just going to start out with the curves adjustment, and as we can see, looking at our histogram over here, you can see that there's a little bit of peaking in both the highlights and just a tad in the shadows. So I'm going to bring those a little bit closer to each other, bring those highlights down just a bit, and bring the shadows up a bit as well. And then this is a pretty bright exposure, so I'm going to start by darkening the shadows down here, and then add the contrast back in by brightening the highlights, and then just fiddle around with these a bit until I get an exposure and contrast that I'm happy with. I think right about there look good enough. That looks alright. So now I'm going to move on straight to HSL, no need for a gradient on this shot. And I'm going to start out by trying to bring out some orange tones in the fence. So I'll go into the yellow and red, definitely saturate the red, and I'm actually going to desaturate the yellow a little bit, which doesn't really make sense because you'd think to saturate this we would saturate the yellow, but the yellow is also going to be present in the grass down here. Most grass is a combination of yellow and green pixels, not just green. So as you can see, if I turn down the lightness, there's also a lot of yellow going on in that part of the frame. So I'm going to desaturate it a bit, as well as desaturating green to kind of push those closer to gray. So already we've got a big adjustment there, a lot more stylized of a look, but I'm going to keep going with that. And I think what I'm going to do is shift the green over a little bit to more of a cool tone so it complements the look in the fence. Don't push it too far because it'll look weird, but just enough, and that's a very interesting look in my opinion. So even though our shot didn't really have a complementary color scheme, we can still use the saturation and the hue to shift this green a little bit closer to blue so it complements that fence more. And we can even take that color contrast a little bit further by using the teal shadows again, and as you can see, that's just going to add a little bit more contrast in the back here, and then I'll finish it off with a sharpness effect. And there we can see our original clip followed by the grade that we did. Quite a big difference, but I think it looks pretty cool. So I thought if you wanted a good understanding of how I color grade my footage, it would be only fitting to use an example from one of my tutorials. This is just the usual shot that I use for the voiceover in all of my videos. So I'm going to show you how I color grade this. It's different for every video, I must admit, but I have a sort of a thing figured out. Sort of. So for this shot, I'm actually going to start out with a white balance adjustment since I have a few different color temperatures of lights. This one's obviously very yellow, whereas the light on my face is a white umbrella light, and this light in the back that's lighting this wall has a bit of an orangish tint. So before I adjust the brightness and contrast, I'm just going to use this white balance effect and drag this eyedropper to somewhere in the frame that should be white. So this desk behind me is supposed to be white, so if I drag it back there, it's basically going to fix the white balance and get it to where it's accurate by shifting that to where it is actually white. So now I can move on to curves, just drag that onto my clip, and as we can see, there's a little bit of peaking in the highlights. Bring that down just a tad, as well as a little bit in the shadows, which I'll bring up a bit. Now, since this is a pretty bright exposure, I'll start with the shadows, bring that down. Obviously that's way too dark, so I'll compensate by bringing the highlights back up and just fiddle with these, get it to somewhere that I like. I think that looks good enough, not great, but good enough. One thing that I don't really like about this setup is that there's definitely an imbalance of the lighting on these two sides. So this side over here, I like having the light on back here, but it's a bit bright as compared to the shadows on this side of the room. So I'll just add another color gradient before the curves effect, set the opacity to 50%, and I'll use that to kind of darken that side of the room. not too much, but just evening out the lighting over there. So that's a bit more balanced effect, and we're kind of toning down the distracting highlight back there and bringing the attention back to my face. Now we need to move on to HSL, and there's one important thing that we need to use HSL for in this shot, and that is the disgusting bright green wall in the background. So I'm going to use the yellow and green because, as we can see, we have both of those going on as part of that wall. So I'm going to start out with the yellow. I'm going to desaturate it a bit, and then I'm going to desaturate the green as well. And what I want to do with this wall is make it a little bit less of a green because I don't think that fits into the color scheme of the rest of the shot. I want to make it a little bit more yellow, a bit more orange. So I'll shift that yellow over a bit. As we can see, it gets closer to red, and then I'll fix that awful the imbalance of color back here by shifting the green as well to match it. As we can see there, that's pretty good, but it's definitely messed up the skin tone. So what I'm gonna do is bring back the color in my face by saturating the red just a little bit, and then I pretty much just have to fiddle with these a bit so I can get a good balance between how yellow that wall is and how accurate the skin tone is, basically. So give some, take some, mess around with the balance a bit until I find something that I think looks good. And I think that's good enough for now. That's alright. And as you can see, we've toned down that wall in the background without really affecting the skin tone that much. Finally, I'll just add the teal shadows to add some more color contrast into this shot, and then sharpen it just like the rest of my clips. There's our original clip as compared to the graded clip. Pretty significant difference as usual, but I think it looks alright. Now here's a different clip for two reasons. There are a couple different challenges here. One of those is that it's a night clip, so if we push the colors too far, we're going to see a little bit of grain and distortion coming out, especially in the shadows. And this is also a clip that's mostly cool colors, so I'm going to have to find a way to bring back the reds and yellows and go for that complementary color scheme. So as usual, I'm going to start out with curves. And as we can see, looking at our histogram over here, there's a little bit of peaking in the highlights, as well as the shadows. So I'll just bring those down a little bit, as well as bringing the shadows up. And then since this is a somewhat dark shot, I'm going to start out by brightening the highlights up, and then compensate by bringing the shadows down, and then fiddle with the balance between those two until I can get an exposure and a contrast that I think looks good. Since this is an outdoor night shot, you can tell it's outdoor, there are no lights around. I'm not going to make it like unrealistically bright, that doesn't make any sense. I'm going to keep it dark while still retaining that detail. Alright, so if we add hue, saturation, and lightness, and start out by bringing that blue down a little bit. I think the blue saturation is a bit much, especially since it's nighttime. Bring that down a bit and shift it a little bit more of a teal color. As we can see, there's definitely an imbalance of color here. The blue is really dominating the frame, and we're not seeing any kind of yellow or red tones to balance that out, except for these headlights. But as we can see, the actual color of this grass by the side of the road is kind of a yellowish, orangish shade. So we can bring back some of that detail and it'll look realistic. We just have to find a way to do that. And the way I would do that is by going back into the curves adjustment, going into the red tones, and then I'll just bring the colors in the shot a little bit closer to red and a little bit further away from blue, so we can bring back some of those warmer tones down there. And as we can see, when we've done that, we've kind of suppressed
the blue part of the shot even more, so I can actually bring that saturation back now and it'll look alright. But I'm also going to take the yellow here, just shift it a little bit closer to red, go for more of a teal and orange look there, and as we can see, we've brought back some of that red and orange detail in the ground. And I don't even think that I'm going to add teal shadows to this, because that just crushes that detail right back down, and like, what's the point of making that effort to bring that back if we're just going to get rid of it again? So I'll just skip the teal shadows and go straight to a sharpening effect. And there's our original clip as opposed to the graded clip. Definitely a more evened out natural appearance. Finally, I want to show you a clip that I shot inside while it was dark. So there's a good bit of grain in this clip, so we can't push the colors too far. So we're gonna have to work around that. And we also need to start out by adding our wide angle distortion effect to this to get rid of that fisheye distortion. As you can see in the curve here, there's some pretty heavy distortion from the fisheye. We can just get rid of that easily. And here's our starting point for the clip. So I'm going to start out with curves, and clearly this is a pretty dark exposure. I didn't want to raise my ISO up too high while I was shooting because it would have gotten too grainy. So I'm going to start out by, as we can see from our histogram, raising those shadows up a bit so we're not crushing the black pixels too much. And there's even a little bit of overexposure in the highlights, so I'll just bring that down just a tad, and here's a good starting point. As you can see, this entire clip is pretty underexposed, so I'm going to start by actually taking not even the highlights but the midtones and bringing those up, and then balancing that out by bringing the shadows down a bit. And I'm just going to really mess around with this. And if you have a very underexposed shot like this with some grain in the shadows, sometimes it can help to raise the black point even more. As you can see, that kind of suppresses the grain in the shadows and hides it a bit, but it's a little bit weird of a look for me, so I'm just going to keep it how it is and move on from here to HSL. And what I'm going to do with this is just what I normally do, and looking at this shot, I can see I can definitely go for a complementary color scheme here with orange and teal. We can see that we have some yellow on the ground from the yellow lighting in this area, so I'm just going to shift that over to be more of an orange color. Then I'll move on to complementing that with some blue, which we can see right here. If we just go into the blue and shift that to more of a teal color, then we'll be able to achieve that effect. And magenta's a kind of tricky color when you're going for an effect like this, where you want that teal and orange color scheme, because it's right between blue and red. So if you shift it this way, it'll get closer to red, but it'll look weird in the blue areas. Whereas if you shift it the other way and shift it closer to blue, then it'll look good where it was next to the blue areas, but it'll look weird when it was next to red. So I'm just not going to touch that one at all. I think that's the most natural way to go about that. I think having the magenta in there even gives the shot a little bit more personality. So I'm going to try adding teal shadows to this. Since there are a lot of shadows, it might not help, but in my opinion that does actually help the shot out. It gives it some added contrast without sacrificing that detail and crushing the shadows. So I'll just move on to sharpening, and there's our final grade. So we haven't compromised much of any detail in the shot, but we've brought out those colors and given it more of a complementary color scheme.
But that is all I have for you today. I hope you learned something from seeing the ways that I would color grade different shots in my videos. I've been getting quite a few requests for this, so I hope that this answered some of your questions, and if it didn't, just stick around for that other shorter, more edited down video going over this entire process. So I hope you enjoyed this video or learned something from it. If you did, do feel free to show your support by leaving a like on the video or even subscribing to my channel. I upload 2 new filmmaking tutorials every single week, and I'm doing a live stream this Wednesday. I believe that's in 2 days, so just a live stream probably at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll put the time that'll be on the screen when I decide on that. So feel free to show up for that and ask me some questions about filmmaking or just anything for that matter. So that's all for today. Keep creating. I'll see you in the next one.